We have discovered that even if dopamine neurons are not damaged, if they are dormant, Parkinson's disease can still develop. This leads us to wonder if awakening these dormant neurons could improve Parkinson's disease. Dopamine is one of the essential happiness hormones. However, if too much dopamine is secreted, in this video, let's take a closer look at dopamine, the cause of Parkinson's disease. Dopamine functions both as a neurotransmitter and as a hormone. The established theory is that Parkinson's disease is caused by damage to dopamine neurons. However, recently there has been research that proposes a different mechanism for the development of Parkinson's disease, so I'd like to briefly introduce it. There are results from a joint study conducted by the Korea Institute of Science and Technology and Seoul Asan Medical Center. They found that even if dopamine neurons are not damaged, Parkinson's disease can be triggered if the dopamine neurons are dormant. There are cells called astrocytes, also known as star-shaped glial cells. Astrocytes function by supplying nutrients or removing waste between nerve cells, and the neurotransmitter GABA, which is an inhibitory signal secreted by these astrocytes, can put dopamine neurons to sleep, causing Parkinson's disease to occur even without damage to the dopamine neurons. As I read this study, two thoughts came to mind. First, I wondered why astrocytes secrete the neurotransmitter GABA, which sends inhibitory signals. This is just my personal opinion, but I wonder if, when excessive stress accumulates, our body instinctively and reflexively secretes an excessive amount of inhibitory neurotransmitters to suppress the overactive neural excitation in order to control that stress. In other words, I think it's possible that stress stimulates astrocytes, which in turn put dopamine cells to sleep, potentially leading to the development of Parkinson's disease. In fact, when we look at people diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that quite a few of them have been exposed to extreme stress for long periods of time. Another thought is about toxins. Whether dopamine neurons die or simply enter a dormant state, it seems that a lack of dopamine leads to Parkinson's disease, whose main symptoms are motor-related. However, if the dormant state of the dopamine system can cause Parkinson's disease, then perhaps if we could wake these cells from their sleep, we might be able to improve the condition. I also think that, from a therapeutic perspective, a dormant state might be easier to treat than actual damage. Alternatively, I wondered if, in the early stages, dopamine neurons might be in a dormant state, but if this situation persists for a long time, it could eventually lead to cell death. And if my thoughts are indeed valid, I truly believe that if we can accurately and reliably identify the early warning signs that may predict the onset of Parkinson's disease, it could greatly help in the treatment process by awakening and stimulating dopamine-producing cells before they are damaged. Please keep in mind that these 2 points are purely my personal speculation. Returning to the main topic, let me briefly summarize dopamine, which is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. Our brain is like a massive chemical factory, producing various types of chemicals every day, and dopamine is one of the chemicals synthesized in the brain. Human emotions such as joy, sadness, happiness, and unhappiness are closely related to neurotransmitters. There are hundreds of billions of neurons in the brain, and neurotransmitters are the substances that transmit information and signals between these cells. So far, about 50 types of neurotransmitters have been identified, and dopamine is one of them. In addition to its function as a neurotransmitter, dopamine also acts as a hormone. Dopamine is also known as the hormone of immersion and pleasure. It is one of the essential happiness hormones that are absolutely necessary in our lives. An appropriate amount of dopamine gives us motivation and energy, allows us to focus on a single task, and lets us experience pleasure. That's why dopamine secretion increases when we encounter people or things we like, or when we are concentrating. Let me briefly share another of my personal thoughts here. Parkinson's disease is caused by a lack of dopamine. So instead of relying solely on medication prescribed at the hospital for treating Parkinson's, I wonder if meeting people you like or finding activities you can focus on and immerse yourself in could help increase dopamine secretion and thus also aid in the treatment of Parkinson's disease. However, if too much dopamine is secreted, it can lead to mania. Or, if the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which controls impulses, is continuously stimulated, it can become difficult to suppress one's impulses, resulting in various addictive behaviors. In particular, excessive secretion of dopamine is often associated with people who become addicted to things like gaming, shopping, gambling, or alcohol. Alternatively, if dopamine levels become too high, it can cause hallucinations or lead to schizophrenia, a mental disorder characterized by psychological abnormalities. On the other hand, Parkinson's disease is the representative degenerative neurological disorder caused by a deficiency of dopamine. And when dopamine secretion is insufficient, a common condition that can occur is depression. In fact, I believe that the reason why depression is very frequently accompanied in patients with Parkinson's disease is due to this. In this video, I explained about dopamine. I believe there is already a lot of information like this in books or online. However, what I wanted to convey to you through this video is my personal opinion, which I mentioned as my own theory. There is no doubt that Parkinson's disease is a degenerative neurological disorder for which medication is extremely important. However, considering the fact that a lack of dopamine causes and worsens Parkinson's disease, I want to emphasize that when trying to overcome Parkinson's, it can be very meaningful to think about and look for ways to produce more dopamine in your own brain's chemical factory. Parkinson's disease is a condition that appears due to a deficiency of dopamine, and the primary treatment for Parkinson's is a medication called L-DOPA, which increases the concentration of dopamine in the blood and delivers dopamine to brain cells. That's why dopamine-based medications are the treatment for Parkinson's disease. However, what I want to emphasize is that in Parkinson's disease, the substantia nigra in the brain, which secretes dopamine, is not completely destroyed. This means that, depending on your own efforts, the remaining brain nerve cells can secrete more dopamine. The additional dopamine released in this way can help improve aspects of Parkinson's disease that medications alone cannot address. Also, as you continue taking medication, you may develop dependence, and the effectiveness of the medication can diminish over time. Because of this, surgical treatments may eventually become necessary, but if you can stimulate dopamine production in your brain's chemical factory through your own efforts, you can delay the need for such surgeries. Even while taking medication, the amount of dopamine is often still insufficient. My conclusion is that increasing the physiologically insufficient amount of dopamine in this way is a meaningful approach.